Economic D-Day. That is the warning that the US has issued to Iran. Essentially, a global crackdown on Iran's financial networks, which leaves the rest of the world waiting to see whether the new tactic of economic pressure will succeed, where military pressure has so far failed. In order for this plan to work, the US is essentially reliant on other countries to stick to these sanctions. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has threatened, you guessed it, more sanctions against anyone doing business with Tehran, calling on world leaders to essentially choose between America and Iran.
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of US sanctions. That if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted. We find that the best way to engage with countries is through quiet diplomacy, and we are level setting with every country to tell them our expectations. We know who they are, they know who they are. So when the hammer of U.S. Treasury actions falls upon them, they will have no one to blame but themselves.
Okay, so let's take a look at what these new sanctions actually are. The US is threatening sanctions on countries that refuse to cut economic ties with Iran. Bessent said President Trump has been personally calling world leaders and requesting that they stop doing business with Tehran. The new sanctions will target 5 of Iran's most vital lifelines, these being digital assets, technology, gold, aviation and shipping. And the goal is to sever every economic lifeline and isolate Iran. Well, to get into all of the details of this, I am joined now by Hussein Banai, an Associate Professor of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. He specialises in US-Iran relations. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us here on DW today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
We will get to the US threats on Iran's trading partners in a minute. But first, what makes this fresh round of sanctions any different to past worst ever sanctions imposed by the US?
Well, it's unclear, and I think with most policy initiatives coming out of this White House, it is very high on rhetoric and very thin on specifics. All we know so far is that in that graph that you showed, that the United States intends to basically sanctions any countries that do business with Iran. But also in that previous clip that you showed, you heard the Treasury Secretary say that if there's evidence that money has turned into repression inside Iran, that there would be sanctions. So it's all over the place, frankly. It's not clear how different it is from previous rounds of sanctions. Remember, Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries on the face of the planet already. It was under a regime of severe sanctions under previous administrations, not just this one. So it's not clear exactly how this is increasing the temperature on Tehran, but it is very high rhetoric indeed, you know, language of D-Day and global economic catastrophe, et cetera.
Yeah, it's all quite dramatic. And it seems now that the slightly newer tactic is to hurt Iran by going after its trading partners. So which countries are we specifically talking about here?
Well, China seems to be obviously one of the main countries, Russia, Turkey. There are trading partners with Iran in the Persian Gulf area, some of the Arab Gulf monarchies, which ironically have sided with the United States in the war against Iran so far. But if you go deeper, you find that the network of countries that Iran does any kind of trade with also do a great deal of business with the United States or have supported U.S. positions against Iran at various points. So they're being punished essentially for carrying on with their own business of economic statecraft. It just so happens to be with Iran.
So that is essentially the punishment then, because like you just said, the US has already had extensive sanctions on Iran, some stretching back almost 50 years. So was the thinking kind of, okay, well, we can't really hurt you anymore, so we'll just go after your mates?
Well, I think what's significant here actually is that this language of sanctions is being previewed before us after a long military campaign. I think it is implicitly an admission of the defeat of that previous strategy that the US pursued of militarily attacking Iran. Normally, countries impose very severe sanctions in order to preclude the military option. And here you have a war that was carried out in two phases, a 12-day war first, and then a much longer protracted war. And it's very clear that the administration is, in effect, saying that that military campaign did not bring about the results we wanted. So we're going to go the route of economic sanctions, which is something that many people were saying you could have pursued in the first place. So it is wrapped in irony and all manner of strategic confusion once again.
And Trump has been on the telephone making calls to countries that do business with Iran. Bessent has said that they should prepare for US sanctions. Who specifically has the president actually been talking to, and who do you think the threats are going to work for? I mean, if the US imposes sanctions on China or Chinese banks, they're most likely going to retaliate.
It's unclear who he's been speaking to. Frankly, the call sheet probably, when it is released, it's going to reveal countries that were already part of some sort of coalition of the willing to begin with, or that they were insignificant in terms of any kind of economic pain they could have brought to bear on Iran. I think they want to project that they are very seriously pursuing a policy package here that could hurt the rest of the world. But this is akin to trying to unknot a mistake by pulling at both ends, by making the initial strategic mistake of not having thought about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz before attacking Iran or doing long-term planning, now trying to kind of deal with the consequences by implicating other countries' economies into this war in a way that would really threaten, at the end of the day, the welfare of not only U.S. economy, but U.S.'s strategic partnerships as well.
And do you think that countries that have in the past found ways to continue trading with Iran will continue to be able to do so again?
It's unclear the amount of trade that Iran is doing with countries that is sizable enough that could be deterred by this policy initiative by Washington, because a lot of these countries had already pulled back significantly in terms of their kind of open direct trade with Iran. So Iran has really been sustained through a regime of clandestine commercial interests and networks tied to its Revolutionary Guards and its own very concentrated economic interests. Those entities are already heavily sanctioned. So what remains is really a paltry sum compared to that much larger, sizable portion of trade that Iran does, mostly related to its oil and petrochemical industry. So I don't know who this is meant to deter, but if it is China, we already know that that language was used before at the initial phase of the latest war. And the Treasury very quickly issued exemptions to Chinese companies because China could retaliate also in a significant way that could hurt American industry.
But at the same time, Bessent did also say that China wouldn't necessarily be exempt from this. And China is obviously a major country that needs to be considered in relation to all this. So is it kind of just all talk then, if they have already provided exemptions to some Chinese companies? How does that work?
I think in this war and in this particular conflict between Iran and the U.S., the ratio of empty rhetoric to actual practical action is somewhere between 90 to 10%. And I think this is part and parcel of that. If it is meant to really scare off the Chinese, I think it begs the question as to whether Chinese economic trade with Iran is in fact what is sustaining this regime. And the answer is no. Every Iran analyst would tell you that the resilience of the regime is something that is much more internally driven than having to do with its support from Beijing. So I think, to go back to my earlier point, this is in a way an indirect admission, whether the White House recognizes it or not, of the failure of its strategic outreach to many of the countries around Iran. And this is just the latest round of this, frankly, implosion of a very important, highly sensitive national security portfolio.
Okay, and which countries or economies would you say would potentially be the most affected if they are genuinely forced to significantly reduce their trade with Iran?
These would be countries neighboring Iran, many of whom have kind of border trades with Iran. So you're looking at Pakistan, you're looking at India through border routes as well. You're looking at Iraq, which is actually a major trading partner with Iran. Turkey would certainly be affected in this regard as well. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Central Asian countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Those are the kinds of economies that would be probably most affected through such sanctions. Russia and China obviously do a great deal of oil-based business with Iran, but those already, as I mentioned, are subject to highly restrictive sanctions to begin with. So it's unclear what other big kind of great power, regional power size countries would be affected by this.
And just picking up from what you said about oil there, because that's obviously been, I mean, one of, if not the main topic of discussion when it comes to this war. But the sanctions, I found interesting, are reportedly intended to target 5 of Iran's key lifelines, which are digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. So why is oil not at the center of this strategy, given that it remains such a crucial source of revenue for Iran?
Because the U.S. blockade is in place already there, okay. And Iran has successfully closed the Strait of Hormuz, is able to navigate the traffic through that lifeline that it has. So they've already, all of this is meant to really open up ultimately that closure of the strait by Iran. But can you do it through sanctions on aviation, secondary sanctions on digital assets? I'm not sure it adds up to something that's going to compel Iran to open the strait.
Okay, so then what is the most likely outcome here? Do we end up with some countries cutting ties while others continue doing business with Iran? And if so, what does that mean for the overall effectiveness of the sanctions?
Well, I mean, at one level, I think this is a kind of way for the U.S. to take a straw poll on which countries are really going to abide by what the Treasury wants to do and which ones are going to thumb their nose. It's unclear what the punishment would be. They haven't announced any rates or what the specific punishment for countries that violate this would be. Those details are not out yet. But if it is not significant, which I don't gather it will be, it's very likely that by next week, the news will have moved on to something else, having to do with tariffs, perhaps, that the U.S. has decided to impose on another country or whatever other news item. And this will become yet another data point in this conflict that can be added to, failed talks in Islamabad, the memorandum of understanding, which doesn't seem to have accomplished much, a ceasefire that was really half complete and never really a ceasefire from the moment it was signed, and essentially not as important as it is made out to be. Okay, well, on that happy note, I think we will wrap it up there. Hussein Banai, an Associate Professor of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. Thank you so much for breaking that all down for us and for your time here on DW Tonight. My pleasure, as always. Well, viewers, we want to get your take on all of this too. Do you think that this new crushing economic takedown will lead to US victory? Or is it all just talk? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. I'm Hannah Hummel. See you next time.